Today's message is going to be a little different. Dave's been taking us through Hebrews. Now we're going right back to the Old Testament, and it's going to be something of a storytelling, something of a big saga that I'm going to tell you with intrigue and irony and plots and murder. Just a really good story. So some of you might know I've had this book of God on my heart for quite a while. It's the book of Esther. So that's where we're going to be today. Now, boys, don't switch off because you think, oh, well, this is a girl thing. It's Esther. No, 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 no. There's lots for boys here too. And even though it's a story that was written, set in Persia, a land far, far away, in a time long, long ago, roughly 2,500 years ago, I think it was 483 BC, even though it was so long ago and so far away, there's lots that I feel is still so relevant to us today. It's the same God that does miracles today as he did back then. And there are things that are relevant to us and lessons that we can learn right now where we are. So I want to start off. Now, it's such an amazing story with so many details that at first I thought, well, I'll just gloss over it. But as I started to remind myself how wonderful it is as a story, I thought, I can't just gloss over it. So we're going to have a good old look at this amazing story, as if it were a play, and we'll go Act 1, Scene 1, and Act 2, Scene 1. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn to the very beginning book of Esther. It's just after Nehemiah. So the story begins with a powerful king, King Xerxes, and he's having a lavish banquet. They seem to have a lot of banquets in those days. They're having a lavish banquet, and he's showing off a little bit in front of his cronies, and he calls his beautiful wife to come in and parade and show off how beautiful she is. But she says no. Imagine the king's outrage. What? You won't come in and parade yourself? She says no. We pick up in chapter 1, verse 20. The king says, Vashti is never again to enter the palace of King Xerxes, and let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. See, Vashti made a big mistake. There's only one mistake. One strike, you're out. Out you go. Now we find a better queen. How does he go about that? Suddenly, his officials go through the land and round up the most beautiful virgins in the whole countryside. You could say this was probably the first, maybe not the first, but the biggest beauty pageant of all times, all the girls coming along. Now, I'm sure for those girls it could have been quite overwhelming, coming from their families and thrust into the life of the palace. And one such girl, as you well know, her name was Hadassah. She had been brought up by her cousin Mordecai because her parents had been killed. And so in verse 2, we see the virgins are gathered up. And verse 4 of 2 says, let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. And a little while later, we hear that Vashti has come in to the palace and Haggai has taken a shine to her. One of the first things we see with Hadassah is that wherever she goes, it seems like there's favor on this girl. Why is it? Wherever she goes, there's favor. The first verse 9 says, the girl pleased him and won favor. And a little later, towards the end of that verse, it says, Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. So quickly she rises and she gets the king's favor. Of course, it's not so easy. She has to have a long time of preparation. You can't just step into the king's presence. There's many months of cleansing, many months of beautifying. In fact, it's 10 whole months that she spends getting herself ready before she sees the king for the very first time. But immediately she wins his favor. He's captivated by her. And of course, what do? But they have another banquet. There's always banquets. So if you were writing a little story, you would think, well, that's kind of the happy ever after. The common girl who's an orphan suddenly thrust into the limelight. Suddenly she's queen of this amazing country. Maybe that's the end of the story. It could be. But God has a much bigger plan. Much, much bigger plan. Did something happen with the lights all of a sudden? Oh, that's all right. God has a much bigger plan. So she's queen. Chapter 2, verse 22, I want to have a look at. If you're there. Where is it? Back at back at the King's Gate. Now, in those times, the King's Gate was a place where the officials would all gather together to discuss the things of the day. It was kind of like the hub, the meeting place, the Starbucks equivalent of everybody sitting together and catching up on the news. Now, Mordecai, her cousin, is sitting there, and he overhears a plot to kill the king. Word gets sent to Esther. She then tells the king. Long story short, he finds out, oh, these rumors are true. Someone was going to try and kill me. What did they do? Immediately, they take those two people and they hang them. Dispensed of them, they're out of the way. Surely this should be the end of the story. So you've had the queen, she's foiled a plot to kill the king. It's a happy ever after. But no, there's much, much more. So chapter 3, or scene, I like to say like scene 3, if this was a movie, the camera would open with Haman now. He's now the baddie we're going to see. He's the highest official in the land. He's throwing a tantrum, a supreme tantrum, because Mordecai refuses to bow to him. You see, Haman was elevated to such a place of honor that it was expected that if you came across him, you would bow and scrape and show deference to him. But Mordecai wouldn't. And so Haman opens in chapter 3 with him really stamping his foot and being very cross. So he thinks, well, what can I do to get my revenge on this Mordecai? He's really extreme. So instead of just taking it out on one person, he decides, I'm going to make a whole new royal decree. I'm going to run to the king and ask him, we're just going to get rid of all the Jewish people. So we look at verse 5 of 3. Having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. Is this perhaps the first instance of planned genocide? I don't know. But I'm sure if you were a Jewish person at that very time, you would be quaking in your boots. What do we do? It's a very scary situation. And the next time we see Mordecai, again, he's at the king's gate, wailing in sackcloth and ashes. It's a time of great mourning. All the Jewish people, for them, death is imminent. You know, when the king makes a decree and he puts his seal on it, that's pretty final. It's not, well, maybe we'll be okay. It's pretty final. You are going to be put to death. So the whole country, the whole Jewish race, they're wailing. So what can be done? Well, Mordecai sends word to Esther and says, look, you're our inside person. You're on the inside. You've got to do something. Go and speak to the king and see if you can get help for the people. Well, it's easier said than done, because in those times, you couldn't just appear before the king. We are so blessed as Christians that we can come straight into God's presence. Like even this morning, we walk straight in from wherever we've been, straight in, we're worshiping, we're singing our songs. If that was the old times, we would be in serious trouble. You couldn't just run into his presence. So Esther realizes that there's something happening here. She realizes that God has maybe called her for such a time as this. Jared, do you want to put up that slide? Perhaps this is the moment for which you have been created. I think Esther had that moment. The enemy is really against us. There seems no way out. Suddenly I find myself the queen of a kingdom, yet my people are about to be wiped out. Could it be that God's put me here for a bigger plan? And sometimes we have to pause in our life and think, where has God put me right now? Is there perhaps a bigger plan than the one that I'm seeing right now? So she decides she has to see the king, but before that, she better get on her knees. And so she does what you should do in a crisis, run to God. So she calls a time of prayer and fasting. That should be our default setting, is to run straight away to God, to fall on our knees. I love that song that we sang this morning, I'm falling on my knees. When we get to that place outside of ourselves, that should be what we do. We should fall on our knees and ask God. Well, when the 3 days are up, you can take that down, I think, Jared. Thanks. When the 3 days are up, she goes before the king. And we see, indeed, his favor. He allows her to come. his favor, and now she shows amazing wisdom. If I was Esther, the first time, if I had been ushered into the king's presence, I think I would have just blurted out straight away, "You've got to help us, because this man, he's really evil, and he's going to do this, but you have to help us." But she doesn't. She shows incredible restraint and wisdom and patience. She just says, "I just want to invite you to another banquet." She doesn't put all her requests out. She first invites the king to another banquet. Can you show the next slide, Jared? Esther was a queen who knew the power of when to speak and when to remain silent. You see, sometimes it's not so much what we say, it's sometimes when we're quiet. Sometimes it's when we're restrained. Sometimes when you have self-control, when you want to just blurt something out. We need to have the wisdom to know when it's the time to speak and when to stay silent. So in chapter 5, verse 6, I want to pick up. The king says, "I'll give you anything you want, even half the kingdom." But as I said, she just invites him to another banquet. And then he asks her again. Again, banquets, isn't there? There's lots of banquets happening around here. Huge restraint. And I think, yeah, there's a banquet today. Maybe not quite as lavish. I don't know what they used to eat back then, but not quite as lavish. But a banquet nevertheless. The king was obviously very intrigued. I think this is also clever, being clever. By not telling him all the details, she kind of pulled him in a little bit more. Now, this is where I think things get really interesting. And I see God's sense of humor, how the story unfolds. We see Haman a little later going out, and he's in a very good mood. He's happy this morning. He's in a good mood because probably he's got the king's edict to say that all the Jews are going to be wiped out. So he's like in a fairly good mood. But as he goes to the king's gate, what happens? His good mood is spoiled because he passes Mordecai, and instead of Mordecai quaking in his boots and bowing and begging, he doesn't show any fear. Well, that really gets Haman really upset. It's like he's spoiling his fun. He's having a good day. So what does he do? He goes charging home to his family, because that's where you can vent. And he's telling them, first of all, he says, "I'm the king's favorite. The king loves me. And you know what? I've even been invited to a banquet. And only the king and I have been invited to this banquet. The king really, really loves me. But you know what? There's this one man. He's just spoiling all my fun. He's robbing the joy out of my day. It's just spoiling my day." So his family say, "Oh, well, how about this for an idea? Why don't you build a big gallows? And then you can hang him on that. And when you've done that, then you can go to your banquet and you can eat, drink, and be merry with the king, and your good mood will be restored." So Haman thinks, well, that's a really good idea. I think I'll do that. So he goes and he builds a gallows. Where was that? Have a gallows built 75 feet high and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go with the king to the dinner and be happy. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the gallows built. So he's now again in a happy mood. Happy mood, bad mood, happy mood now, okay? Now, meanwhile, if this was a movie, you'd kind of go to the next scene. Meanwhile, the king is in his chamber, and he's restless. He can't sleep. He doesn't have late night TV to flick on the shopping channel or anything. What can he do? So he gets someone, I know, I need to get someone to read me a bedtime story. So he gets one of his aides, or whatever you call them, to come and read to him. Not a bedtime story, but one of his chronicles. I suppose if you're a king, you like to have your ego stroked a lot. So he likes to hear about all the wonderful things that he's done. So he's reading this ambassador, whatever he is reading from the king's records. And while he's reading, he's reminded about this man, Mordecai, who saved his life from a plot. So the king goes, what did we ever do for that fellow Mordecai? Well, the guy says, well, actually, Your Majesty, nothing. Nothing ever happened to that fellow Mordecai. Meanwhile, in comes Haman. He's now come charging in to speak to the king. You see, because he's so highly elevated, he doesn't have to wait. He just goes on in, and he has to tell the king about his gallows. And he comes in, and he says, I want to speak to you, Your Majesty. But before we can tell the king about the gallows, God's sense of humor here is amazing. Before he can mention the gallows, the king says to him, "Now, Haman, what would you do if there was someone that you really wanted to honor? Someone that's really pleased you, someone that's done you a really good favor. What would you do to that person?" Well, now imagine Haman. He thinks, this must be me he's talking about. I mean, like, I'm the favorite. Well, he says, and it's all down here in, where is it, verse 6, somewhere near there, from 6 onwards. Haman says something like this: "Well, I think you should get a robe, a royal robe. Not just any royal robe, one that the king has worn. Put it on this man. Oh, yes, and then put him on a horse, or one of the king's horses. Then parade him through the streets and tell everyone, this is the man that the king honors." Haman likes this idea. It's really good. Imagine his dismay when the king says, "That's an excellent idea, Haman. I want you to do that for Mordecai." Can you just imagine? Can you just imagine the irony? Can you imagine his face? That would have been a real Hollywood Oscar moment, going from being all happy to like, but what can he do? The king said he must do that. I mean, imagine his humiliation and shame. Imagine what his family were going to think. I mean, he's just had the gallows built. He didn't even get to the best part about telling the king about the gallows. Now he's got to honor Mordecai. So in 6 verse 11 it says, "So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai. He led him on horseback through the streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" I'm sure he didn't say it, so it was like this. You know, the words are quite brief, how they describe this, but I'm sure he wasn't a happy Haman leading him through the street. Imagine having to say those words. "This is what the king does." The words were probably killing him. He was having the worst day ever, 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 ever. Afterwards, of course, what does he do? He goes back home to his family. He wants a little bit of sympathy. Shame, the poor man. And his family, he's really cross. Now he's wondering, how can I get at Mordecai? But his family are wise now. They say, "We don't think you must mess about with this guy Mordecai anymore. The king's got his eye on him. Best you back off a little bit." So that's where we get to, where was that now? And while they were talking with him, so he's with his families, the king's eunuchs arrive. And they take him off to the banquet that Esther has prepared. Maybe his mood goes up a little bit. Well, at least there's still the banquet. And, you know, maybe this will be nice. And it says, chapter 7, "So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And as they were drinking wine on that second day, the king says again, 'What is your petition? You can have anything you want. What is it?' Now, I'm sure Haman wasn't expecting what he heard next, because what she says next is this. She says, 'O king, if I have found favor with you, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. I just want my life.'" Imagine the king. I mean, he's smitten with her now. She hasn't asked for anything, and now she's saying, can I have my life? What? "And can I have the life of my people? This is my request." Imagine that. And then she goes on to tell him about Haman. She says, the enemy, the adversary for my people is Haman. Well, imagine the king's outrage. This is his very best person. That's twice on one day that Haman's had a really bad day. Poor Haman, I'm sure now he's going, how can he undo the edict? But he can't. What can he do now? The king is so angry. It says, again in very few words, it says, "The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden." In a rage, off he goes. He's really, really upset. Out he goes. And of course, now Haman sees his chance. There's only one thing that he can do, is plead with Queen Esther. So the king goes out. He gets up to go and plead with Esther, and he throws himself before her. Now remember, she was reclining. They used to eat kind of reclining down on their day bed. As the king comes back in again from the garden, what should he see but Haman just about sprawled over his queen? That's the last straw. He's like the absolute last straw. He says, "Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" Big mistake. I think Haman knew now, uh-oh. And then, of course, I think the most amazing divine reversal, the king says, knows, look, we've got to deal with him. And one of the little eunuchs pipes up, oh, bless him. He says, excuse me, king, but there is a gallows that Haman just built, and I'm sure Haman's going, no, don't mention the gallows, don't say anything about the gallows. But it's right here in the Bible. Isn't this amazing? A gallows 70 feet high stands by Haman's house. He had it made for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. Hang him on that. And then without further words, it just says, so they hanged him. It's like really brief to the point. So they hanged him. That was the end of Haman. Is that the end of the story? Or is there still more? Jared, do you want to put the slide up? Right. Pride goes before destruction. That just sums up old Haman very, very well. There's many scriptures in the Bible that show pride. He's a perfect example of pride going before a fall. Do the next one, boy. Okay. Just when your enemy seems to have the upper hand, place your trust in God and realize that the day set for your destruction may actually be the day of your deliverance. Keep that one there now. So Haman is out the way. Great poetic justice. Isn't that just like so perfect how God just did that? Haman is out the way. Is that the end? Well, not quite the end. You see, God still has something else to do. It actually gets even better. Mordecai, who was nearly killed, suddenly now finds himself the new number one. Esther gets all of Haman's estate. All Haman's sons, by the way, also get put to death. And the king says that on that very same day that the Jewish people were to be exterminated, on that very same day, the Jewish people were given the right to assemble and destroy all of their enemies. That is perfect divine intervention. The Jewish people should all have been wiped out, but on that day, they get the complete upper hand. And it then goes on for 2 more days, and it becomes a day of feasting and celebrating. And it's the feast that we know today as Purim, and still celebrated. And we'll see this in chapter 9. I've skipped ahead a little bit. In chapter 9, this is Purim. Chapter 9:19, is that what I said? That is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other. And later on, and these days of Purim should never cease to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of them die out among their descendants, because that was the day that should have been their destruction, but actually became their deliverance, more than their deliverance. So what a victory. Isn't that just the most amazing story? I just think that's it's got everything in it. You've got the rags to riches, you've got the romance, you've got the plot to kill, you've got the beautiful dramatic irony and poetic justice. It's just the most amazing story. And for me, it says so much personally. To me, it says that no matter what situation we find ourselves in, no matter when you feel like your back's against the wall and there's no out, God is working behind the scenes. God has a plan far bigger than we realize. He is always working behind the scenes. You see, he wasn't surprised by Haman. He wasn't surprised by anything. God worked everything for the good of his people, every single thing. Sometimes we can get caught up in the situation. You think, gee, God's forgotten. Think of, if I just digress a minute, think of Lazarus. His family must have thought, gee, Jesus is forgotten. He's dead now. It's too late. Now what? What's the point of calling Jesus? Now he's already dead. But God had a much bigger plan. He wanted to raise the dead, not just heal him. God had a bigger plan. And sometimes God has a bigger plan in our lives. Proverbs 19:21 is one of my favorite verses. And I say this in our family a lot. Many are the plans of a man's heart, but the Lord's purpose prevails. We can have lots of plans, but God's purpose prevails. So we can take courage, no matter what our situation is. We can trust that God can bring redemption. I want to just look at 10 little points, just very briefly, that we can remind ourselves from Esther's life. The first one I want to say is Esther was beautiful. Obviously she was. But beauty is more than skin deep. I work with a lady who's disabled on a Thursday, and we do art. And she's she loves to tell me, Sandy Williamson, beauty is as beauty does. And I always say, yes, you are right, you are right. Beauty is more than skin deep. You see, Esther might have got her initial into the palace because she was very beautiful, but she needed to have the character to get her any further. All right. The next thing, Esther was teachable. She listened. She was teachable. She listened to the advice of Hagar. She listened to the advice of Mordecai. You see, when he said to her, don't tell anyone yet that you are from the tribe of Benjamin. Don't tell anyone yet that you are of the Jewish people. She was obedient to him. She was teachable. We need to be open and teachable. The third thing, and one of the main themes of the whole story, I think, is favor. Esther had favor. But this is where I have a but. Favor alone doesn't qualify you for success. Favor is an opportunity. Favor gives you an opportunity. But with favor comes responsibility. You see, Esther could have just sat back on that favor and been lavished in the palace, had servants running around, enjoyed just being the queen. Oh dear, the Jewish people were going to be wiped out. But it wouldn't have touched her. She could have just rested on the favor. Sometimes God gives us favor, and we can just rest in it. But sometimes we need to look a little bit closer and realize that with this favor, there's a responsibility. I believe that God gives us divine favor because there's a reason. So that favor is a tool. It's not an accomplishment. It's not a badge that we wear. Favor is a tool to accomplish something bigger. So if we look in our own lives, where has God given you favor? Where can God give you? Where is there an in? Where do you have opportunity? God can use you if you have favor, but you need to be willing to look at it and put some work into it. I think you can take that one down, Jared. Thanks, son. Where am I now? I had a quote here that says, one day of favor is worth a lifetime of labor. Sometimes favor is being in the right time at the right place, the right time, but what you do with it is important. The next point I want to make is that Esther understood the value of preparation. Any great battle, my boys will tell me they love battles, but any great general would not go into battle without first preparing. He would prepare. Esther and the other girls, we don't hear about them, but they spent months and months and months preparing. The first part of the preparation was all purifying, and the second part was all the beautifying. Let's be quick to keep our hearts prepared to enter the King's presence. Even though it's so easy for us to walk into God's presence, let's make sure we take time regularly to prepare our hearts, to make sure that our hearts are right. The next thing that I love, Esther sought the heart of the king, not the splendor of the palace. And we see that when she was repeatedly told, you can have up to half the kingdom. That was very generous. I'm sure she could have said, oh yeah, I'll have that and just squirrel it away somewhere. You can have up to half the kingdom. But she deliberately turned it down. She wanted time. When she asked to see the king again, she was asking for time with him. Seek the heart of the king. And sometimes in our lives, and I'm the first to admit that's me, I can run to God, and the first thing I do is, good morning, Lord. Lord, today I need this and this and this. And you know, Lord, and I'm going to do this, and I need this, and I need this. Very easy for us to run into the Lord's presence and have a list, a whole list of things that we need. But we need to first seek the heart. Seek the giver, not the gifts. We hear that quoted a lot. You see, our intimacy with God gives us access. But out of that access, then we can ask him for what we need. But let's make sure that we seek his heart first, not his splendor. His heart first, not his gifts. even the giftings. It's lovely. We can say, I want to be able to heal people. I want to be able to prophesy. I want to be able to do this, all in your name, Lord. But first, let's seek the heart of the King before we ask for all those things. The next point is courage. We need to have courage. Esther showed great courage. That one scripture, I didn't look at it, there wasn't time, but where she's going to meet the king and she's praying and fasting and she says, if I perish, I perish. I think that's one of the most courageous verses spoken in the Bible. If I perish, I perish. She had courage. You see, she used her position. She used her favor. But she was willing to risk everything for her people. Do we need courage to do something? Has God asked us to do something? Has God asked you to do something that you need courage for? Let's ask him for courage. I remember for me, one of the hardest things was when we were leaving South Africa and God had told us to come here. For me, I had a very up and down dysfunctional childhood, and security was a very important thing. And for the first time in my life, I found I was married to the man of my dreams. I had at that stage, three beautiful children. This was it. And suddenly God was asking me to give it all up. And so I was bargaining with the Lord and saying to the Lord, okay, I'll go, but my dream house in Hout Bay, I just want to keep my house. So I'll go, Lord, but we'll just rent the house out because this is my security. This is everything. This was my inheritance from my daddy who died. We had this dream house. And the Lord said, you don't trust me. And I went, I do trust you, Lord. Sure, aren't I going to Ireland? I do trust you. No, the Lord said, you can't have a back door because that's not courage. Courage is when you say, I'll give you everything. You won't have a back door. And that took all my courage. I had to wrestle with that and say to the Lord, okay. And the Lord is very gracious because in that moment, I said to the Lord, okay, if it's really you, does anybody else do these like a fleece before the Lord? I confess I do that. But I said to the Lord, well, if it's really you, Lord, then our house needs to be sold in 2 weeks. It needs to be a cash buyer. They need to love everything about my house. They even need to love my dog. And what was it? That was it.
Not to change anything.
Yeah, they mustn't change anything. I don't want them changing my house. I love my house. So who does that? Now this is in Hout Bay years ago. Houses don't sell in 10 days. Well, 3 days later, somebody walked into the house, loved the house, said, can I buy the dog too? I love your house. I don't want to. In fact, I love your house so much, I'll buy everything, even the curtains, even your duvet on your bed, every single thing in your house, I'll have. Gee, I went back to the Lord going, okay, well, you're not joking. This is really you. And you know what? That's given me courage, even in times here when it's been really hard for me and I've felt my knees knocking. I've been able to go back to that and say, yes, Lord, you did a miracle for us to be here. That gives me courage. Anyway, I'm digressing. The next thing, Esther kept her eyes on the king, even when there was an enemy at the table. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was Esther, having to sit with Haman and smile and drink wine, not once, not twice, but 3 times, I don't know if I would have been able to do that. I would have put a little dig in there or spat in his eye or something. But she was gracious. She kept her focus on the king. She kept her focus on the big plan because she knew God had a bigger plan. There was a destiny at stake, not just hers, but her people's destiny. But she kept her eyes fixed on the king. And for me, that was a real lesson because I can be easily distracted, maybe we all can, by different things, by problems, by issues, by worries. But can we keep our eyes fixed on the king? Don't let our emotions rule our heads. Fix your eyes on the king, even when there's an enemy at the table. Even when there's an enemy at the table. And sometimes your enemy might be doubt. Your enemy might be fear. Your enemy might be discontent or a relational problem. Fix your eyes on the Lord, even when there's an enemy at the table. Just like Peter. When his eyes were fixed on Jesus, he could walk on that water. When his eyes were fixed on the wind and the waves, he quaked and started to sink. Fix our eyes on Jesus. The next thing is Esther knew how to ask from a place of authority. You see, when we have intimacy with Jesus, when we have an intimate relationship, that builds our platform for us to be able to ask the Lord. We can come before him and we can ask what we want with confidence. The next one I want to mention is faithfulness. Faithfulness is highly rewarded. And sometimes it can be, you can feel that you're overlooked, whether it's at work or at home or at church even. You faithfully do something and you think, does anybody ever notice? But faithfulness is always rewarded. Remember that reward delayed is not reward denied. Mordecai was faithful. The minute he heard about a rumor, he went straight to make sure the king knew about it. And there's a big gap between him foiling that plot and him getting some recognition. Maybe in between, he thought, gee, has he forgotten? Maybe when he heard the edict that Haman had made, that all the Jewish people must be put to death, I'm sure Mordecai was thinking, gee, and I saved the king? What's going on? But his faithfulness was delayed a bit. His reward was delayed, but it wasn't denied. God will honor you, so don't worry. God sees everything happening behind the scenes. Don't worry. Keep serving faithfully. And the final thing, Esther finished well. You see, she could have just stopped, but she made sure that she finished well. If you go back in the Old Testament and you remember Saul was told to wipe out all the Amalekites. He didn't finish the job. And then, if you read, lots of problems happened because he didn't obey completely. Esther made sure that she obeyed completely. She brought things to a closure, even though it seems quite severe that she had all Haman's 10 sons put to death. She was bringing closure. She was being completely obedient to what she felt. We mustn't allow little things in the camp. Sometimes we think we'll deal with the big major issues, but little things, let them just be in the camp. They're harmless. Corinthians 10 verse 4 says we must demolish every stronghold that sets itself up against Christ. So let's look in our lives and not let those little foxes come in. Let's demolish every stronghold. Let's not tolerate lesser evils. Let's make sure that we get rid of them. You see, you'll be victorious and you overcome, no matter what the enemy throws at us. Do I have another slide, Jared? I've kind of lost the plot with my slides, but that was a lovely one. Even when we feel that God is silent, we can be confident that he's working and orchestrating things with exact precision for his glory and for our holiness. Even when we think, I'm in a situation, God, do you even see what I'm struggling with? You can be sure that God's working behind the scenes. Somebody very dear to me always reminds me. She says, God is not surprised. And I love that. It speaks courage into my heart so many times when she says to me, darling, God is not surprised. So wherever you are and whatever you're coping with today, be encouraged. God's not surprised. He's working behind the scenes for your good and for his glory. So what do we need to do? We need to live in that place. We need to live in that present. We need to not fret or worry about our destiny. We need to not worry, how's it all going to work out? We just need to keep our eyes fixed on him. We need to make ourselves ready for that moment of divine favor. We need to, when that moment comes, we need to step through. We need to carpe diem, seize the day, be courageous, take that step and know that God has put you here for such a time as this. God has put us here for such a time as this. Every one of us in this little room, God has put you here for such a time as this. South City Church is here for such a time as this. So let's have courage. Even when it looks like it's really difficult, let's encourage one another because God has us here for such a time as this. Do I have another slide, Jared? God's plans for your life far exceed the circumstances of your day. God's plans for South City Church far exceed us just existing from week to week. We believe that God has amazing plans for us as a body. Isn't that right? Can I hear an amen? Amen, yes. God has made us. He will carry, sustain, and rescue us if we just keep our eyes fixed on him. So for me, I always like to sum it up in one little word. So most of what I've said you might forget today, but I'll leave you with this word, favor. Favor. We want to seek God's favor. F, fix your eyes on the King. No matter what's around you, F, fix your eyes on the King. A, act. Be willing to act. Don't just sit there, do something. Be willing to act. Fix your eyes on the King. Act. Be obedient. If God says, go and tell that person on the Lewis that I love them, just go and do it. Get up off your seat, act. V, F-A-V, V, valor. God needs people of valor, of courage. Don't say, I can't do that. Valor. Be courageous. Strengthen feeble knees. Whatever it is it's asking you to do, be courageous. Maybe it's to pay for the lady's coffee who's behind you because you never know, she's maybe having a bad day. Maybe it's to help somebody with their groceries in the supermarket or just pay for them. Do what God tells you to do. You'll be amazed at the high that comes after that. Fix your eyes, act, valor. O, obedience. Let's be obedient. God calls us close. Out of that intimacy, out of that love, let's obey him. If you love me, you will obey me. Out of love comes obedience. U, F-A-V-O-U, unselfish. If God has got you somewhere for such a time as this, it's not just for yourself. It wasn't just for Esther's pleasure that she was there. It was the destiny of a whole nation. And R, this is the key for me. Everything happens in relationship. Nothing, I believe, happens outside of relationship. It's first about our relationship with God, and then it's about our relationship with one another. So remember that favor. Fix your eyes. Act. Have valor. Be obedient. Be unselfish. And mind your relationships both ways. And then watch what God will do in such a time as this. Amen. Maybe we can just pray.